Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere in dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
Oh, boyo alert, boys and girls. Welcome to the Stoa. I'm Peter Limberg, the steward of the Stoa, and the Stoa is a place for us to cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of this very moment. And we got everyone's favorite bad boy from Ireland, Uberboyo. If you're not familiar with who Uberboyo is, he runs a popular YouTube channel where he talks about Jung, Nietzsche, and Jordan Peterson, and adjacent topics like collective consciousness and individuation and shadow work and good stuff like that. He also has a coaching practice where it helps people manage their anxiety, improve creativity, and learning emotional intelligence. How this fine gentleman got on my radar is I think Alexander Bard introduced us via email, and then we had a few calls that we hit it off. And we've been trying to kind of like go on each other's podcasts for a while. So I thought, let's just get two birds with one stone. You come to the Stoa, you repost it on your channel, talk about whatever you want to talk about. So how today's going to work, for those of you familiar with the Stoa, Uberboyo is going to share his thoughts on the topic at hand, which is the pandemic of groupthink. And then it'll be around 10, 20 minutes. And if you have any questions throughout, throw them in the chats right now. Put Q or question and then have your question. I'll call on you. You unmute yourself, ask your question to Uberboyo. If you want me to read this on your behalf, because this will go on YouTube, indicate that and I'll read it on your behalf. That being said, how are you doing, my friend? Oh, you're on mute.
All right, I'm unmuted now. Am I good? Hello, how's the crack? What is happening? Thank you very much for the lovely introduction. Your song nearly lulled me into a trance. I was actually astounded when you stopped it. The Irish instincts kicked in. I was like, should I start drinking and dancing now? Who knows? I'm sort of turned into the token leprechaun. Hello, Jeff. How's the crack? So would you like me to rock in and sort of talk about what I was thinking about talking about today, or how would you like me to go about things?
Yeah, I think it'd be best just to jump into it and then just queue up your questions in the chat when you're listening.
Sweet. Well, a lot of people probably know me because I'm talking about Mr. Carlos Jung, the famous guy that Jordan Peterson always talked about, and everybody sort of like heard about Jung before and whatnot. And maybe the part that kind of sticks with my channel the most is the notion of the Red Book, and this kind of, because Nietzsche has his Thus Spoke Zarathustra. It's a very prestigious book. I remember when I went to read Thus Spoke Zarathustra, it was like one of those things that I built myself up to, and there was all this anticipation going into it. It's like, oh, it's the great book and all this. And Jung has the Red Book as well, and it's quite different from almost everything else he does because it's not that intellectual. It's very you could say it's going down the artistic route, and that's perhaps the thing that I hit on the most, is the sort of creative side of all this type of stuff and what it means to be an artist. And that Red Book and what that means and everything that's wrapped up in that, it's only came out like 10 years ago, by the way. He kept it away until 2009 is when it got published. He actually died before it was like released to the public. And I've always wondered why there's so much allure to it, like the way with Nietzsche's Zarathustra. Why is there so much allure with this book? Like, what's going on? Why do we give it so much gravity? Why is it so scary when you're walking up to it? And of course, Jung's Red Book, well, the story behind it is that he goes schizophrenic, he goes psychotic, he goes mad. He basically starts hearing voices. You know, the last thing you want to start hearing is voices in your head that are not yours. And he gets the whole shebang. Things start showing up, and yeah, someone's saying the black books are coming out as well. That's an important thing. But the things are coming up in his head and speaking to him, and you're kind of thinking to yourself, what the hell is going on here? And he of course, being a psychologist, was like, all right, I'm doing a crazy, man. I'm going absolutely mad. Something bad is happening here. And I find this kind of a difficult thing to interpret. I don't think anybody has really got an interpretation on this that's really wrestled it down to make sense of it at all. But the more I've dug into it, the more I've started to see that I think Jung hit upon something here that was incredibly important for, shall we say, the nature of the West, or whatever we call ourselves, or the place that we are right now, and sitting in the middle of a massive mental health crisis as we are, and a post-industrial society where pretty much everybody is unhappy and getting involved with some very, very interesting outlets for their rage is perhaps somewhere you could start looking. But of course, Jung doesn't have a good reputation, despite the fact that he is a prestigious one, maybe among people like Jordan Peterson. He's actually seen as a quack. He's seen as a quack by quite a lot of the people in psychology. And I remember this distinctly because I had a friend who wanted to do cognitive science, and he wanted to specialize in Jung, and he actually said it to all these people on the board who were going to take him in, and they all laughed. Well, not laughed, but they sort of kind of like rolled their eyes when Jung's name came up. This is someone who's not actually taken serious in the big bad world of academia. And you would probably expect me to come here and say to you, oh no, okay, Jung's actually a badass and all that, but I'd actually agree with them to some extent. Like, I guess in order to possess Jung, to really do him justice, you might have to risk destroying him. And this is actually kind of a scary thing, because what happened after Jung was the advent of neuroscience, hard neuroscience. And what a lot of Jung's theories are like very intuitive descriptions of what he discovered. And what you notice is the quote unquote the Jungians, and I'm going to kind of rag on people here a little bit, is that it feels like a replacement religion, like the way the Christians would always talk about Jesus and morality in the Bible and all that. You notice this when people get into Jung, it turns into this sort of set of jargon, set of like cult-like behavior and all this type of stuff. And it's like my shadow, my anima, and all this type of stuff. And there's this weird, and it's a very human thing, this weird grabbing, this ability to grab the words and think that you possess the experience is what I'm going to roll with here. And so a lot of the neuroscience comes up, and people all start to go that direction, the more hard approach to psychology, because psychology doesn't have a great reputation for being a hard science. If you look up the replication crisis, you would kind of understand why these people in the academics are very, very nervous about what's going on with psychology, because it seems an awful lot like woo-woo the more you look into it. And so Jung gets thrown out with that. And of course, if we are to be serious and we actually want to resurrect Jung in some sense, or even discover if he's truthful, we have to risk destroying him. And of course, the Red Book then becomes very problematic, because the Red Book starts to show itself as a man going insane, a man with schizophrenic delusions. And if we're going to be, serious scientists and really like study the knowledge and all that, it's not doing his case very good. It's kind of like, this is a dude who had serious problems, it looks like, that type of thing. And so that kind of puts us in a bad spot. It kind of looks like Jung was a blip in the past, the kind of like thing that we got caught up when everybody was taking LSD in the 60s, and it's kind of over now. And it's like, all right, maybe Jordan Peterson gave it a blip again, but it's probably going to drift away. But of course, I don't think so. I don't think so fully. And the reason why I'd say that is because I think neuroscience has gotten to the point now where we are actually in a place where we could start revisiting Jung in a serious way. And I've never seen Jordan do this, by the way. The only person I've seen do this is perhaps Ian McGilchrist. And we're going to talk about this a little bit. So there's the most fundamental thing you'll notice about the brain when you check out a brain is that it's cut in half. It's split in two. There's two big parts of the brain. And of course, if we're going to like try figure out what the brain does, this giant division in the brain is seriously something we should start asking ourselves. Like, does the brain just do that randomly, or is there a point? Now, what it turns out is that there's actually a massive point to this. And so much so that animals that are less evolved, other animals that you say don't use their brains as sophisticated as we do, don't have this split as significant as we do. So there's also this suggestion that the brain split in us is actually key to what makes us, human, if you will. And the main thing about this brain split, the way we've evolved and the advancement of the human brain split is that actually the more evolved we are, the more that they sort of don't talk to each other. So it seems like they've both got two different roles, and they need to turn one off in order to do their role, and then it switches the other on to do its role. All right, this is the left hemisphere, right hemisphere. I'm going to use the shorthand of saying left brain, right brain. People get mad at me. I don't care. All right, this is the thing. And so what we start to see with this modern neuroscience that the people like Ian McGilchrist come along, and it's actually really well studied, and it's like one of the most solid things of all, is that we have inside of ourselves two big chunks, two big presences, if you will. And you might not think it's that big of a deal. It's like, all right, you can tell me that's all right. But there's this weird thing that when people used to have epilepsy, they used to cut the brains in half. So if you cut the corpus callosum, the connector of the brains, and let them be themselves, you can actually ask both sides questions, and they'll give you different answers, all right? So what is this telling us through the evidence? It's telling us that inside your head, there are two people, basically. I'm going to run with that. Now, they would never say that. They would say, shut up, Stefan, don't be jumping to conclusions. But of course, maybe I'll have a bit of a I'll have a bit of a diatribe here about the nature of science and philosophy, and this is going to be very triggering. You know, science and the scientists and the almighty lab coat and their data gathering capabilities, most certainly important. But of course, what we finally see is the most important role of as Nietzsche said, the philosopher of the future, is to be able to categorize this data into useful categories that we're able to use as descriptors and guiders to the way we go forward. And actually, what goes on with these two brains is very much related to that. So what we have right now is actually a really well-studied proof that the brain has two sides and they do different things, but we don't have anybody who's able to make sense of it. Ian McGilchrist did probably the best job so far by saying master and its emissary. You've got one side of the brain that acts as this sort of general, and this other side of the brain that acts as a sort of soldier. And so what the general does, this is the right brain will say, is it tells the soldier to go do things. This would be the left brain. Soldier, go on Facebook and look through all your notifications. And that would be a meaningful activity, is what the general will say. And then the soldier does and gets all wrapped up in that and then comes back out. Full of dopamine, gets all wrapped up in that and comes back out. And I'm kind of bouncing through a lot of things right now, but I'll try to stick as solidly to the point of all, is that when you cut these two brains in half, they sort of have different presences. It seems like they do different jobs and they talk different, suggesting that there's two forms of consciousness in your head that are not unified. And then one of them is actually, it looks like very, very, shall we say, unaware of the other one. And this is the one that is also the most related to what we would understand as self-consciousness. So this is starting to look an awful lot like what Freud and Jung understood as the ego. And then this other one is starting to look an awful lot of what they look like as the idea of the unconscious, because didn't they say that the unconscious has a sort of weird intelligence, a weird ability to do things with intelligence that we didn't expect. And so what we start to see when we start to look at this stuff, and I think this is the main thrust of a lot of the things I've been talking about recently, is that the hard science is starting to give us the data to almost take what these guys like Freud and Jung and Nietzsche were throwing language at to try and make sense of, this phenomenological experience inside of their head of like voices coming in and all this type of stuff. And they're starting to give us tools and say, this is going somewhere. There's something to this. And now the science is starting to show us that there most certainly could be. Now, if we think about the modern paradigmatic perspective on the nature of the mind, we assume, and this is sort of related to this idea of the collective, we assume that we're all rational individuals that just need to get presented the evidence. And then what's going to happen is that we'll just adopt the right opinions. But of course, Freud and Jung were never for that. Neither was Nietzsche, of course. But they got disproved because they weren't scientific enough. They were woo-woo artists. Now we have harder science coming in, suggesting even harder again that it's like, yeah, those guys were actually right on premise. And it starts to be extremely explanatory towards everything that we're seeing around ourselves, what's going on. And so I guess that's the crux of what I'm saying. I notice in the Red Book, it starts to, the more I read the Red Book and the more I read this stuff about left brain, right brain, and Ian McGilchrist, the more I start to see the relationship between how these two things are married in some type of sense. I'll give you a very, very quick example, and I think we could wrap it up there, is that, for example, the left brain, the soldier, is sort of deployed to do missions. Emissary means missionary, you know, deployed to do missions in the world. And the right brain is the guy with the big perspective that is able to see the big picture and decide what is important and meaningful for the left brain. And the problem in our head, which what goes on is like the left brain, the ego, if you want, gets too caught up in its mission and loses sense of the big picture. And so what the right brain has to do is jump in and shock it and grab it and tell it, no, you're doing the wrong thing, come back on track. And there's this is kind of weird because the left brain is not really aware that the right brain is there. It's very, very strange. And so perhaps that experience of these two sides of the brain talking to each other, remember that they're actually really divided and really inhibited from acting on each other. Perhaps that's close to what we could understand as some instances of stuff like psychotic breaks and some instances of how we understand like perhaps voices in our heads and all this type of stuff. It's very, very weird stuff. But the thing is that as weird as it is, there is some solid science to back it up. It's what we get the romance and the dynamism of jumping to crazy conclusions, but also we have actually decent evidence now to say that this is not just Freud and Jung studying empirically their patients and drawing ridiculous conclusions because they're all on cocaine or they're all like absolute psychosis crazy bastards like Jung was. And we get some very, very interesting and stuff from here. And so perhaps what happened to Jung was, of course, his right brain invading his egotistical left brain and setting him off course. And I would say that was my spiel. That is my shtick. That's my shtick currently where I'm at right now. I don't know what you make it at. Do you think I'm a madman? Are you going to shout me out the room? I don't know, but there you go. I've given it all. So I guess, Peter, any thoughts?
All right. So if you have any questions, start throwing them in the chats. So the title of this talk, Pandemic of Groupthink. Do you have any thoughts on that and like how this may relate?
Yes. Okay. So there is a huge relation to this, of course, because the big first thesis, the first principle of the modernity of the way that we organize our collective societies is we have this notion that we have all we need to do is get presented the evidence and we will rationally make the right decisions. We have this idea that our brains are this one thing, and the problem with our brains is that the right information has not been put inside of them. That's the thesis. All right. You think about everything that's going on right now and everything in terms of like arguing and like culture and all that type of stuff is this idea that people have the wrong things in their head. Think even about the idea of stuff like censorship. You're saying the wrong words. We need to put the right words into your head, and then all those bad emotions will go away. All right. So there's this thesis that you are just a united, enlightened soul, and what goes into your head information wise is what determines your head, and what comes out of your head is a signal of all that. It sees you as a single thing. This is the Enlightenment perspective. Now, what Freud and Jung did is they subverted that. This is why they were such a big deal. Nietzsche did it first, really. And they were suggesting that there's this huge unconscious force that you have to almost develop a relationship with in order to develop a complete character, a complete perspective, a sophisticated perspective. Now, this is a huge problem, because if that's true, that means this thesis of how we become individuals responsible in society as democratic members to guide society towards the good. If we run with the thesis that Freud and Jung presented, that just can't work in the way that we're doing it right now. That cannot work in the way they're doing it right now, because the way education works, where it's just put in information, the way politics works, where it's get the right information, all of that is completely against what Freud and Jung are saying. It just does not work. It does not compute. Now, of course, that's been ditched, but this left brain, right brain stuff is now coming back to haunt us and say there's a serious suggestion that this stuff is real. And then what we start to go down is back to these psychoanalysts, and we start to see stuff like, cognitive dissonance is very famous, that people have already decided what they want and where they want to see things going. They've already decided their positions based on emotional, unconscious reasons. And there's no reasoning with them. There's no reasoning. And this is on all sides and either sides. And we're kind of stuck in this spiral where there'll be a lot of chatter. There'll be a lot of talk. There'll be a lot of the debating. You go on Reddit, you go on Twitter, you'll find plenty of debates about people trying to like show themselves the right information and all that stuff. But that's going to slowly like that maybe very slowly will turn minds, but definitely not as a whole. And that's kind of a scary thing to get into. So if we were to talk about a pandemic of groupthink, I wouldn't necessarily say there's like, one bad perspective and all that, although there's plenty of bad perspectives out there, but more that there's a sort of psychological underpinning, a psychological perspective underpinning this that's putting us in a very scary place. Let's put it that way. So I don't know if that answers your question.
And when we were chatting before, we're talking about, my area of interest, the culture war and stuff like that. And as I told you, Jordan Peterson was my therapist before he became famous. And it's quite a weird thing seeing your therapist become like a culture warrior. Do you think there's a reason why a Jungian, a psychotherapist went into the culture war the way he did with his analysis?
Oh, it's a good question. That's a very good question, actually. That's a very good question. I think my understanding of Jordan is that he was very, very unconscious of this. So him and Sam Harris had a conversation. And right at the end, the whole thing was crap, to be honest, in my opinion. But right at the end was one of the most lucid and beautiful moments I've seen in the intellectual sphere in a long time. And Sam and Jordan were asked by Douglas Murray, it's like, well, what do you understand as, I think it was evil, okay? And so Sam kind of dribbled and tripped up and all this type of stuff, and he's like, "Oh, that bad thing." I don't know. He said something very, very, very shallow, and you could almost see that there was like it was like a computer trying to give an informative answer. You know what I mean? And then Jordan like literally paused for a moment, and it was almost like it was in his voice. There was this depth and heaviness in his voice, and he made some type of statement that he knew inside of him he could like basically, you know, like the idea of like the shadow, you could hold down on someone's neck and squeeze until they have no life left, and he knew that he had that in him. He knew that there was a absolute lion inside of himself. That's because that's what we are. We're monsters. You know, we have that in us. All of us do. Your nervous system has that in you. Now, this I think exposed everything, because Jordan was someone who was aware that his ego, his little bubble up in here of rational consciousness that goes about the day, that is not his entirety. And the thing that drives a lot of his behavior is unconscious, if you will, is in the nervous system or the right brain, whatever you want to call it. And tied to that is for example, the predator can come out when you're in danger and kill someone. If you talk to someone who's ever been in war, they will post-traumatic stress. They'll often say that the experience is an outer body experience. What does that mean? It feels like you're watching yourself killing people. And what does that mean? It's like your ego suddenly lets go and lets the nervous system do what the instincts are good at doing, and it's good at killing stuff. And then suddenly you come back home and you're in shock because you're like, I just murdered like 40 people. And I didn't even do it. Something else did it for me. This is actually really in alignment with how stuff like traditional paganism works. For example, Odin was the god of the berserk state, which is where the Viking warriors would give themselves up to Odin's energy. What was that? Well, an outer body experience where Odin takes over and he kills people. And he kills people for you. He's the god of war. It's a frightening thing. The god of frenzy. It's a frightening thing, but it's the reality of what humanity is. And Jordan Peterson had a grip on that. And tied to that, predator is also tied to negative feelings, all right? So I go through my whole life, and like we live in a brilliant society, but that doesn't stop. You know, rationally, it's perfect. All you have to do is work hard and then you reach the top. Rationally, it's perfect. But people aren't rational. And the fact that there's people winning and you're not winning causes you to just get that little ounce of envy and anger. And life is traumatizing in 1,000 different ways. And the trauma gets stored in your nervous system. I'm doing this now as a psychologist. Yeah, resentment. I'm doing this now as a psychologist. I'm like working with people. And you see it all the time. And it's so scary, man, because you sit down with someone and you talk them through what happened to them. There was a woman I was just talking to recently, you know, you're talking through what happened to her. She's telling you that she's just gone through this mad divorce, okay? And she's saying that she's dealt with it. And I talk her back into her nervous system. I talk her out of her left brain or ego into her right brain. And she's rationally explained to me that she's absolutely fine. There's nothing wrong with her. And I just talk her into it. And I'm not telling her what to think. I'm just asking her to go there. And she just erupts crying. Because she's really fucked up still. She's not like broken, but she's just like, it's hard. It's hard to go through stuff like that. You take like 40 punches in the face and stomach throughout like this long year of going through a divorce. And you store all that in your nervous system. And you eventually get over it and you develop like a sort of ego to help you get through it. And that's not an ego and like arrogance. It's just like, you know, your day to day to finish your to-do list instead of breaking down crying all the time. But then you kind of work into someone and it's still there. And it erupts like energy. And that's the trauma you're picking up. That's the bad energy you're picking up. And we all pick it up. I hate to say it, you know, and we store it in the unconscious, stored in the nervous system, stored in the right brain, whatever you want to say. I don't care about the words. And Jordan Peterson, I believe, was aware that there's a lot of people out there picking up traumatic energy, and there's no psychological way for them to expel that. And when you don't have a psychological conception, if you're stuck in the rational enlightenment idea, all you have to do is think straight, you won't be able to get rid of that bad energy. And so what will happen is that bad energy will boil up inside of you, and as Nietzsche said, it will fester into resentment. And then what happens is the bad energy, all emotions want to go in a direction. They all want to go somewhere. Anger wants you to go and destroy someone. Love wants you to go and make love to someone. Resentment wants you to go and destroy someone as well. And it all collects together with a large group of people who have got all this resentment inside of them, and it starts to swell up in this like group, and it's just floating there like this dark cloud. And all it takes is one person to walk over and paint a little picture and say, that's the person who caused that, or that's the archetype, you know, the archetype of the capitalist, or whatever you want to say. That's the person who caused that. And this giant storm cloud of anger swirls on top of that. It's like a magic spell. And then you've got 40 million people who want to murder a certain type of person. And that's when you're in a scary place. That's when you're in, like, you know, the crazy stuff that happened during the 20th century and all that. And it's that simple. It starts from that level. And so I think that's a long answer to your question, but I think that's why Jordan Peterson was so relevant. Okay.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, let's pivot to the chats. David Swedlow, you had a similar question.
Yeah, I was curious if you, what do you think about the thought that Jung may be more popular now because we're in a similar kind of war pre-madness, or madness of pre-war kind of, something's happening. We see the kind of the meaning crisis is coming home, right? And so in a sense, what Jung was dealing with was similar, you know. So there's something about that, you know. I'm curious about. I'm curious to hear you talk about that a little bit.
100%. I think this pandemic was very, very interesting for a lot of people because, again, it comes down to how much energy we all give to things like Twitter and Reddit. And I've got caught up in this as well. You know, you go in and you're trying to tell people like, oh, this is where you're not correct. And like, I have these rational opinions that you should really listen to because I've got good information. And you think about what's going on there is that there's this conversation going on. We're doing the democratic thing, which is, you know, it's good intentions. And we're trying to explain to ourselves like the correct way to see the world. But you'll quickly come to this idea that most people have first principles that are emotionally charged that they're never going to move from. And the thing that actually moves first principles, and this is a very, very sad thing about human realities, is pain, is trauma, is strong emotions, shock, right? And you see this on an individual level when you have someone who believes that as a kid the world is all a good place, and then their parents split up. Suddenly a shockwave hits them that can last in their nervous system 30, 40 years and can haunt them like a depression. Very, very strong evidence for that. Depression is very, very tight. Schizophrenia, very, very tight to childhood trauma. Okay, and it kind of hits you in that type of vibe. And you're stuck, and you've got this bad energy inside you. And we go up and we think that we can talk rationally on Twitter, but then what's actually it's gonna take to change the conversation is a hit of bad energy to shake people, to wake people up. And you know, you'll see, for example, you'd see a lot of people say stuff like you don't like, I think there's this thing with Ben Shapiro and Piers Morgan a while ago, and I'm not really a big fan of Ben Shapiro, but there's this thing where I think they're talking about guns, and I think Piers Morgan is saying something like, do you really think the government would try to like hurt you? Are you insane? Are you insane? And then all this stuff happens. And I'd say, like, I think guns in America are just like flying off the shelves right now. So you can see that people have all of a sudden, like, the perspective has changed. And that wasn't people all listen to Ben Shapiro and been like, yeah, he was right. Rationally, he got him there. It was because this shockwave of fear hit the entire population on a huge, and you could feel it in the air. It was actually a crazy time. And I'm not even sure if we're out of it or whatnot. And what was so interesting about Jung's Red Book is that it's almost like he got hit with that shockwave maybe a year before everybody else did, which was World War I. And that's a weird idea. It's like, how does someone get hit early before it's happened? I don't know. Maybe if you're spending a lot of time with patients and talking to them about their dreams, and the dreams are, I don't know, super computer mind is putting all this stuff together, you hear about it early. But it's a very, very weird thing. And this is, you know, where things get a bit loose, but still, it's very hard to say that Jung was wrong. A war did kick off, so he kind of got that one right. And of course, what you noticed in maybe the last year or so, like, things went from, like, even the internet is such an interesting thing. The internet started as this funny place where the memes were very innocent, but then maybe in the last like 5 years, things got like really heavy and dark, and now they're starting to get almost like scary. I think there was almost like around about Trump's election, things were sort of like funny, if you know what I mean. There was a lot of kind of like joking going on, and it was like very lighthearted, and it was like all internet wars, and there's no real consequences to all this. But now there's this heavy energy to it where it's like, oh my God, there's something very serious happening. Like we're in history again. And yeah, I would assume that like whatever's going on with Jung, it would be tied to that thinking.
That's very, very interesting. Because there is, like, compared to, like you said, the 2016 elections, they were, you know, it's intense, but it was a little jokey. But now it's dark. You know, it's fucking dark. And it's really interesting what you said, kind of like the weather vane of these psychotherapists who can kind of pick up on it. Because I did a lot of dream analysis with Peterson about my own dreams. We talked a lot about the culture war stuff before he went into it in his practice. And he did feel like he spoke a primordial language being plugged into that kind of the dream world. So this is very fascinating. Mehmet Keeper, you had a question.
Yeah. Do you think the unconscious should remain unconscious, or should we strive to reveal it to ourselves? is this maybe the final piece of the Enlightenment project?
Is a good question. Excuse the burp. I think that was my unconscious making me burp. It's saying shut up and don't tell them anything. That could have been it. So I would assume I would run with like, oh, look, I'm going to try actually reframe this a little bit, because this is where I think a lot of the Jungian stuff gets in the way. Because what I see with the neuroscience, all right, is that you have a left brain and a right brain. You have your brain split in half, and they have two different functions. And forgive me that I'm not explaining this in comprehensive detail. Like it is a kind of a new thing, but it's important. It's a really important thing. And yeah, I'm kind of doing a bit of a botched job, but think of it like a general and a soldier. So the general has the plan, the big picture, but he doesn't actually go in the field and do anything. And so your ego is the thing that goes in the field with full of dopamine and does stuff. But of course, sometimes the soldier can get lost. He doesn't know what he's doing. He's no big picture, and he ends up doing the wrong thing. He ends up like going on Facebook all day and like arguing about politics, right? When he could probably be better off just like, I don't know, establishing a farm if he was that worried, or actually going out and like healing his relationships with his family. You know, there's their better missions, if you want to say. And so what I would understand as the unconscious is actually this development of a relationship. Like literally it starts with an understanding. It's like, all right, first of all, your head is split in half at the very least, all right? So you got to have this understanding of how to stop this ego and get it talking to the other part of your head. Now, dreams are a great way to subvert that, because it's instantly like, all right, there's another part of your head that makes complex stories at night that you don't do. So that's one. That's just on the table. The quote unquote right brain, it seems to have quite a lot of those characteristics as well. And I would assume that if you want to say to someone how to use your head properly, well, you've got two sides to do two specific roles. And the problem that often comes is that they fracture and they lose coordination. So certainly I think we should try to integrate the unconscious, as Jung might say. Jung, I think, gives you procedural ways that you can do this. You know, go into your emotions, right brain more connected with your sense-based experience. Go into your emotions, go feel all that type of stuff. Get more connected with your body, get more connected with the people around you. Pay attention to your dreams, pay attention to your thoughts, pay attention to pay attention to how you have a little voice in your head that rationalizes these complex stories about the meaning of the world to you. And that's probably a load of crap that you need to subvert, you know? So I certainly think that should be done, because it's about using our heads correctly. It's about using the division of our brain correctly. It's about playing with what we are. We're designed to work a certain way. Don't try force yourself to be rational enlightenment ego when you're not. That's a mistake. So I would certainly say definitely do this. Definitely do this. Now, did you have a second part of that question? I can't remember what it was. No.
No.
All right.
All right. Nikole, you're up next.
Awesome. Hi. So my question is very much, it's related to the question that was just asked before. So I just wrote it here, so I'll read it. And then I'll kind of, I'll touch on my own personal experience with this just slightly to give it some context. So I've recently heard someone say that to fully immerse oneself in Jungian psychology is to move through the world in a way sort of as a schizophrenic does, where everything is sort of imbued with meaning and everything can be interpreted as a sign for your unconscious telling you something. Is this an accurate portrayal of understanding oneself through a Jungian frame? And then like the second part of that was just like through my own personal experience, I kind of had like a wake up moment recently where I realized that I feel that I'm doing that like too much, that I'm kind of like moving in the world in a way where like if everything truly does have meaning, that can just like overwhelm you with trying to understand everything. And then if that's not the case, then what are those signs or what are those moments of realization and what aren't?
I'm going to wreck. Thank you very much, Nikole, for your question. I'm going to wreck all your heads with some of the answers I'm going to give to this stuff, because I'm going to keep defaulting into this left brain, right brain stuff. It's going to become frustrating, but it's not for no reason, because what is so interesting about the nature of these two hemispheres is that this left brain, as I said, the soldier that goes out and does your to-do list, wired full of dopamine, more dopamine receptors over here. So it gets you to do stuff. It gets you to get caught up in the plans, all right? And it's very prone. If a soldier loses connection with its general, it's very prone to panic. And it's like, I got to do this, I got to do this. It loses sense of the big picture. It makes all these elaborate plans. It's really good at making elaborate plans and steps and all this type of stuff, but it doesn't have a big picture perspective at all right? And so this is one of its highly common problems with this type of stuff. Your ego, your left brain, you get caught up in these silly little plans. I do it all the time. It's like, I'll do 50 videos in this topic and I'll plan them all out, and then I only ever get like 1 or 2 done, that type of thing. You know, you just get too caught up in this type of stuff. Your little perspective is trying to figure out the whole world, fit the whole world inside your ego, inside your left brain, inside the soldier's little plan. That's what he's trying to do. He's trying to fit a whole war inside the soldier's little plan. Now, what this right hemisphere does, and this is so weird about it, is that you could actually understand it as like the general, and the general has like all this information coming. He's got all the intelligence agencies and all this. He gets all this information into him. And actually the way this works for you is your right brain does this with your senses, your nervous system. And weirdly, the way you can understand the right brain is like a woo-woo, you know, like you go into yoga, you see the woo-woo girl yoga teacher, and he's like, everything's energy, man. Like, it's all just energy. And that's literally what this right brain is like. It's in connection with the world. It feels the world. It's completely like enriched with the world, a lot more than this left brain. It has the bigger sense of the world, a bigger sense. It's like I've said before, it's like the general who's weird to all the soldiers. He goes up and he picks up all the mud and rubs it between his and smells it. And you're like, what is he doing? But it's special to him. He has a sense of things. He has a connection of things, or her, whatever you want to think. And this idea, I think, of when we have these breaks from the ego, when the ego, the left brain, whatever, it gets subverted, it realizes it's not alone in its head. The right brain comes back online, and it's kind of shocking because everything is connected. It feels everything, and this can be incredibly overwhelming. As I said, your nervous system, you store all these emotions, and someone tells themselves, I've gotten through a divorce, and you baby step them back into the felt experience of their body where they've stored all this, and then it comes up and it can freak them out. It can be such a shock because they're full of pain. They're full of pain, and it all erupts, and they have to feel it all again. And that's probably the hardest thing. But of course, this is what I believe Jung meant by the anima, is that, or the animus, whatever you want to call it, is that when you let this part of yourself erupt and you allow yourself to feel your reality again, because reality is full of pain, so you don't actually want to feel it. When you let yourself feel your reality again, this is where you start to get this sort of feeling of full of meaning, of connected with everything, that type of thing. And I certainly think there's decent evidence for this, you know? So I encourage people to integrate the unconscious and get back in touch with this type of stuff, and think, like, maybe study this right brain stuff and understand what would be perhaps more right brain things that you can balance out your left brain work with, and all this type of, because ultimately they're supposed to work together. But I would highly encourage people to operate in that type of sense, like understand that of all things, the world is full of meaning, not in any way that your left brain ego will be able to figure out. You can't just categorize and make a big plan and make a big model of the universe that will make sense. The world is full of energy, and energy is actually what gives meaning to your life. Jung called it numinosity. You know, it makes things matter to you. Do you see the way people pick up stones, and they're like precious little stones and all this type of stuff? And I think that's actually the more human way to coordinate yourself. That's the type of thing I know I'm kind of getting off track a little bit here, but that's the type of way you could coordinate yourself, is understand that it's more about relationships. It's more about felt relationships with the world. It's more about developing not an intellectual categorization of the world that makes sense, because that's never going to work in the way that you're trying to do it, but on almost building a connected, energetic bridge to the world. And then, as you said, that starts to sound an awful lot like schizophrenia. But of course, if you check out my last video and look through until about 40 minutes, I start talking about the schizophrenia and the relationship to this dynamic that I'm talking about. And it's incredibly interesting how all this stuff connects. So I'm sorry I couldn't answer more comprehensively, but there is my take. Thank you very much.
Cool. Alyssa, you had a question.
Yes, hi. There are many who claim that a collective projection of the father archetype is being placed upon Jordan Peterson. This has allowed Jordan to stand on the positive end of the archetypal spectrum, guiding others in cleaning up their life and bringing order to chaos, but has also resulted in a huge backlash as a representative of the patriarchal system. What is your take? Is Peterson utilizing his insights of Jung to speak to the collective consciousness?
Oh, that's a good take as well. That's a good take as well. It's a good question, and questions lead to good takes, is what I should be saying. So it's a very, very interesting question. Like, is he? I don't think you're necessarily saying this, but does he become a cult leader? Does he become the daddy of the millennials? And again, what I was saying about him earlier is that he digs into the unconscious, and he realizes that, like, you know, he just sort of feels that there's all these people full of trauma, and he can see it in his classroom. They're coming in and they're like really, 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 really upset, and they have this upset and aggressive tone. And they're starting to turn into what he might understand as a collective movement. And the collective movements are almost always formed by collective emotions and anguishes and pains. If you study collective movements, you'll see that at root, there's very little rationale behind them. It's almost always a felt problem and a desperate oppression or injustice and whatnot. Now, of course, he tapped into that trauma and felt that, and he knew that this was coming, and look where we are now. But of course, he also tapped into the lost boys, as they call them, you know, the people who are looking for something, and you could feel this energy. It was everywhere. It's still here, by the way. It's not like that has not been solved at all. And there's a lot of people who are looking for someone to give order and shape and direction. And if you're sort of going in that right brain mode and feeling it, and you're talking to a lot of people, and you'll feel out a lot of people that their lives are a disaster. They can't put stuff together. And there's a lot of people whose lives fall apart, and they get hit by trauma, and then they turn resentful. And then there's a lot of people whose lives fall apart, and they wish that there was some way that they could put their lives back together. And so in some sense, Jordan starts to speak in the opposite direction. He gives you the answer to resentment, which is to, you know, put yourself together, clean your room and all that type of stuff. It's brilliant advice. And of course, what we would start to do is then project him as like a guide, a Moses. I don't necessarily think father. I think him more in terms of like he had that prophetic energy, which is father-like, of course, but he was sort of like the guy pointing for a direction. Do you know what I mean? And this is why I think his criticism was so intense and religious, is because he was someone who was giving people a way, a purpose and a meaning and a belief that there is a way. That's fundamentally it. There is a way forward. I can do something and all that type of stuff. And that allows them to deal with these horrible feelings that a lot of people are joining movements for. You know, and I think that actually comes down to quite a lot of the foundation of what he was trying to do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Chris, you had a question. If you can unmute yourself.
Yeah. I'll just read this here. I said, I'm not so convinced anymore that rationalization is the problem of modernity. Christian scholastics drew a lot from Greek philosophical tradition, such as Thomas Aquinas, being the Christian scholastic, not the Greek philosopher, obviously, and stated that one could know the truth of a God through reason alone, although there is also a component of faith that has to exist within Christianity for the actual Christian narrative, of course. Modernity seems to be descending into an irrational state where there is a denial of universal morality and an affirmation of relativity, and thus a denial of logos. Thoughts, Stefan?
This is a great question as well. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the naughtiest, nasty German incel we've ever heard of, naughty, nasty Nietzsche. And he's the type of guy that you read through him and you're just scratching your head, because he doesn't like Socrates, for example. Well, he likes Socrates, but he thinks he's wrong. And you're kind of like, Socrates is like the famous philosopher who made philosophy. How can you not like Socrates? Like, what's that? What are you doing, Nietzsche? You're kind of going a bit crazy here. And he's like, yes, I am. And Nietzsche proposes that Socrates was the sign of the Greek people degenerating into a fallen state. And you're like, what are you on about, man? What, really? And so the basic thesis here is that when your instincts are strong, when you're in a good shape, you can actually be extremely irrational. When your instincts are strong, you don't need the truth. The truth is useless in some sense. His example, and this is going to trigger a lot of people, is that, you know, the Christians don't have an accurate view of the world, in Nietzsche's opinion, but they took over the world. And it was more because, like, the Germanic people who were carrying it had these like horrible, intense, you know, world conquering energies. They ruled Europe, you know. And they ruled the Irish, you know, the English Germanic people ruled England and Ireland, and they were world conquerors. They had strong instincts. And over a long period of time, what happens is those instincts get weak, and you get out of your body and you kind of float up into reason, and you start to overthink what's going on. And it's like the way that, like, you could be a massive hypocrite, but if you're winning, that's all that matters. There's a lot of game theory things they show where, you know, they'll make little digi robots that like understand the truth, and robots that just try to get to the next level of the game. The ones that go and try to evolve and get to the next level destroy the ones that want the truth all the time, consistently. You know, it's a very, very basic idea. The truth is not that valuable. And so what happens then with this scary thought is that when your instincts get weak, your reason comes in to try help you explain what's happening. And so Nietzsche's saying that what you see with Socrates is that moment where the Greeks, these were the people who made Greek mythology, probably the most sophisticated religious system, bar perhaps Judeo-Christianity. You know, unbelievably so beautiful that even people like Freud and Jung used it for the majority of our conceptions, like Oedipal and Narcissist. And their instincts got weak. They lost their instincts. And so this thinking came in to be a big thing. Oh, let's sit around and think about what we're doing. No, pause, wait there for a second. Let's sit around and think about what we're doing. It's like if you trust your instincts, you never think. You know, I think the Virgin Chad meme, the Chad never thinks. He just does. That's the type of thing. You're just a man of action type of vibe. And so they all become like, you know, Virgin Socrates. Oh, well, pause for a second. Let's figure out what's going on. And of course, the second Socrates shows up, and then they're all trying to figure out what's going on. You have only a couple of 100 years later. Well, basically, you have Alexander the Great who swoops down and takes over all of Greece. And then you have the Romans who come in and just say, "Oh, the really good philosophy, guys. How about we slap a Roman spork flag on it, and then you can keep doing your philosophy there in the corner, and we'll rule you, and you can be the philosophers." How about that type of vibe? And so reason or reasoning or rationalizing, and of course, if you look at left brain, right brain, you'll find that the sort of voice in your head, rationalizing part of yourself, seems to have the centralization in the hyperconscious left brain, the ego, if you will, which is again a very, very scary thing. And yeah, so that's all seems like a signal of falling. And so as Nietzsche would go on to say that, of course, as you're saying, this whole journey between Socrates and Christianity, and Nietzsche would even accuse Christianity, like he's a big fan of Christ, but he'd even accuse Christianity of stuffing all our elite thinkers into little churches that are promoting a philosophy of anti-body, anti-life, anti-instincts, which means that we further fall up into our head, which actually ironically leads to this brilliant laser focus on abstract thinking, very left-brained, which actually creates science, which then through the laser focus of science turns back on the religion and starts to question its own reality, which actually just exposes the religion as irrational and then destroys it and then puts us in the God is dead state. And this whole arc with like the ability to see that is unbelievable. This whole story then leads up to the point where we're at now. And of course, what I think Jung did is Jung sits down, and if you read about the Red Book and the anima which spoke to him, this is where it comes from. He noticed that he was sitting there and a voice came and started to talk to him. But he realized that Aquinas had a voice that spoke to him, the voice of reason and the voice of logos, if you will. But Jung saw it as a female woman, a girl, a chick, you know, the e-girl coming up being like, "Yo, Jung, what's up?" And he understood this as his felt experience coming up. And amazingly, when you study left brain, right brain, as I was saying earlier, right brain, more connected with the energetic world and felt experience, Jung's conception might be more accurate. And that's a weird thing. To what we understand now, Jung might have been more in touch with the correct intuitive understanding of the psychology. You have an animating voice inside of you that's not rational. It's instinctive. And this ties a lot with Nietzsche's assertion that we need to develop a relationship not with a rational truth, but a will to power, an animating energy, if you want to think about it that way. And this is where anima comes from, the Roman word for soul, which means animation, animal, animation, animosity, all those things are tied together. And it's a very, 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 very interesting way of thinking. So thanks for the question. Good question.
Yeah, thank you.
So we got a lot of interesting questions. Ozlem.
How
Yeah.
are you for time then? Because I have someone on, but I'm able to push them back if you got a lot of stuff.
We have 10 minutes. I want to sneak in one more question.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Ozlem, would you like to unmute yourself?
Okay, well, Peter, can you just read it? So I don't have the chat open here, so it might be faster.
Sure. Okay. Do you believe in left-handedness to be associated with more systemic connections with higher speed of both hemispheres, as suggested by Ian McKiltrist? I think that's how you pronounce his name. If so, any ideas regarding why that not to become evolutionary dominant? Any practical ways to build that connection systematically?
I've been exposed. I've been exposed. I actually don't know about that side of things at all. I've no idea what that is. I'll have to look it up. But thank you for the question. I'm afraid I won't be able to give you a good answer on that. I would assume that there's a sort of way that you could perhaps train these parts of your head to talk to each other, and there'd be different characteristics with each of them. Like, for example, our language center is the Broca's area and Wernicke's area is on the left side. And so that says a lot about like the words and voice and meaning and all that type of stuff. But of course, the right hemisphere has the musical sense of language on its side as well. And that's, of course, important things. And I'd imagine there's ways that you can train your brain. And the whole left hand, right hand thing is very interesting. And of course, the more you study this stuff and then think about how in many institutions like the church or even in Soviet Union, they used to force you to use your right hand, even if you're a left-hander. It's all really, really interesting stuff. But I'm not able to give you a good answer, I'm afraid.
So you have something right at the hour, so you're cool to go into that?
Like, I'm loose, man. Yeah, keep
okay.
going.
So I'm going to read this question on Elf's behalf. So how does your left-right framing interact with shadow work, like internal family systems with its various parts, managers, protectors, exiles? Seems reevaluating and reestablishing relationships is fundamental.
It's a really good question. All right. So I'm a bit of a noob. Like, I'm getting exposed here all sides. Like, I don't have a sort of a total conception of like how you apply this stuff to therapy. I do default, go to Ian McGilchrist, look at Jung stuff from this lens. It's brilliant. Jordan Peterson's another great example, of course. But if I was to give you an answer to what you're asking, the left brain, this is so interesting about it. All right. So the soldier, when he's in the trench, the way that he convinces himself to take the next step, the soldier is the left brain, is the ego. The way he convinces himself to take the next step is he gets to use kick of dopamine. That's the next goal. All right. And when something gets in the way of the next goal, he gets angry. Yeah. That feels normal, isn't it? You want to go on Facebook and look at your dopamine things and get angry. Now, getting to the end of an argument is also a goal. And so when you're writing on Discord or Reddit or something like that, and you're saying, I think this, and I can't believe that you don't think that, and you feel anger kicking in, this is, of course, someone getting in the way of your left brain getting its dopamine kick. And so you are not rationally prone to having rational conversations with people. You are full of this monstrous egotistical left brain that wants to just get angry at people and prove them wrong and have crazy fights. And this is not wrong. This is not a silly thing. The soldier sometimes needs to kill people. But if the soldier is running around just like, shooting civilians and all this type of stuff, then you have a bit of an issue. And so you perhaps could come in with this idea that, of course, the anger, the debating, the resentment, it's your fault, this little story that we all have among each other. This is what Freud noticed, that the families are almost like these webs of crap that are just so hard to get out of. And sometimes it's better to just leave for a while and then come back, and kill your father and all that type of stuff. Symbolically. Now, of course, this right brain thing has a very, very interesting take on how you relate with people, because it's better at relationships. It's the part of yourself that feels relationships. It's the part of yourself, it seems to be more dominant with stuff like empathy. It's obviously the part of yourself that senses stuff. It's the part of yourself that can recognize emotions in faces. When someone gets right hemispheric damage, they can't properly understand faces or emotions, all this type of stuff. And so if we're to talk about stuff like relationships, my God, it's all keyed into this other side of the head, if you know what I mean. And there's one dude, if you go on my channel, his name is, I think we say from atheist to Peterson to Christ, and it's a dude called Laszlo. And he went through all this, he went back to his family, and he spent a lot of time sort of like reconnecting with them in an energetic way. And humility was his big virtue. He turned very Christian, and it put aside, the kind of resentment and the anger and all that type of stuff, and allowed him to just reconnect. Like literally his goal was just, I want to reconnect. I don't want you to be correct. I don't want to know what you think about all this type of stuff. I just want to develop an energetic connection to you. I know it's as woo-woo as it can get, but it fundamentally is like changing his life right now. And perhaps that's the model that you can go for. A lot of the problems with our families is that they're rational, intellectual, and there's a great amount of distance, and there's a lot of unsaid stories that are kind of getting in the way, and angers and all this type of stuff. And so perhaps that could be a way to subvert it. I hope that's good enough.
All right, beautiful. So we're approaching the hour. I think it'd be prudent to end here, unless there's one more question that just came in. Maybe we can just jump to it. Kevin DeLand, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Hi, Boyo. I'm wondering how the emotional experiences of what you call the right brain soldier can affect the rational strategies of, say, the left brain in general. And could there be, like, could it end up that there are competing interests? One framework that I sort of mentioned in the chat, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, was like an artificial intelligence cognitive science named Marvin Minsky, who thought of the mind as like a society of mind. And one example he uses is if a child wants to like build a tower of blocks, and he also wants to destroy the tower of blocks. So when he's building it, or maybe the destroyer part of like the agent within his mind convinces the builder to like, you know, build a tower. And then when he's building the tower, there might be conflicting sort of, like he might want to knock it down, but he also might want to build it bigger. So I'm wondering your take on how sort of the emotions of the soldier can affect the rational strategies of the left brain in general, and then how the many generals in your head can sort of duke it out.
Yeah, it's a very good question. There's this weird that's very sort of Freudian, where you have the self-sabotage issue. So it's like, I want to become famous. And why do you want to become famous? So that you can, you know, act out the sort of hidden drama inside your soul, where you want to, like, you know, prove your mother wrong by embarrassing yourself in front of the family. And so you become famous, and then you get drunk and end up naked on the street for the press or something like this. And there's like this weird conflicting thing where you think that you're doing this big drama to get to this top for some magical reason, but really it's about giving you the power to act out some other darker desire and all this type of stuff. And I think there is decent suggestions that perhaps, like, well, for example, these two parts of your head, I'm kind of speculating a bit, but they most certainly can have different intentions and wills. And I think this is what this idea of the right brain butting in and kicking, and, like, you know, the soldier goes off crazy and starts shooting up a town when he should be on a mission. And so the general flies in his truck and says, "What are you doing, you crazy? Stop, come back." He beats him up, he punishes him, or whatever, that type of thing. Like, perhaps that's what a sort of psychotic break is for some people in general, in a speculative way. And that would suggest then that there's sort of two intentions going on. What's so weird about the right brain, the left brain's full of dopamine, the right brain's full of anxiety receptors. So you can imagine that the soldier is going and doing something, but underneath it, you've definitely had this experience. You're on Facebook and you're this little soldier going after the dopamine spirals, smashing away, telling people how they're all wrong, owning everyone, all right? And then underneath that, this big negative mood starts to build, because, you know, if you zoomed out and took a big perspective on what you're doing, you would know that it's like pathetic behavior and you hate yourself for doing it. And so this sort of big mood builds up, and you can almost see there that, like, despite the fact that you're caught up in what you're doing, there's a sort of negative feeling getting built up. Is that perhaps the right brain trying to recorrect you? Is that the general sort of sending you a lot of bad messages, being like, "Stop what you're doing, dude. This sucks. This is pointless. This is bad," this type of thing. And I most certainly think that's possible. And like, in terms of experience, yes, I've seen it happen loads of times. It's happened to me loads of times. It's very, very common. Yeah.
Awesome. So let's end there before the hour. My friend, any kind of closing thoughts for us? That place we can find you, or?
Oh yeah, well, definitely check out the old Uberboyo channel. I think a lot of people would like perhaps to watch the video on the Red Book, Did Jung Go Schizophrenic? That's usually a great place to start, because I sort of fast forward through a lot of this stuff there. Ian McGilchrist is a fantastic, I shill for him big time. And in terms of putting this into procedural practice, yes, like, absolutely, Carlos Gustavus Jung is a great stuff as well. And thank you very much for the opportunity, sir. And thank you, everybody, for all the questions. It's been lovely.
Beautiful. So I'll make some closing announcements in a moment, but my friend, thank you again for coming to the Stoa. Thanks everyone for their excellent questions. Definitely check out his YouTube channel. It's pretty awesome. Upcoming events, we got another YouTube personality, superstar, coming in at 6 p.m. Eastern time today, Memes, Virality, and the Occult, with Chris Gabriel, who does meme analysis. You can check that out there at the link. And then tomorrow we have a bunch of cool events. One of them, Spiritual Mission of America and the Anthropocene. And this is Matt Siegel. He's an integral leftist. He's going to come in and talk about that subject. That should be pretty cool. You can check out a website for more events, our Patreon, and our Substack for daily updates. That being said, everyone, thanks so much for coming to the Stoa today.